It was the kind of morning where the air outside the courthouse felt unusually thick, like it, too, knew something was about to happen. Inside courtroom number 7, the seats were nearly full. Reporters, lawyers, interns, and a few curious civilians waited, their murmurs low but urgent. They hadn't gathered for just another hearing. Today, the country's most polarizing billionaire, Aryan Khanna, was being dragged into court, accused of systematic worker exploitation and wage suppression across multiple factories. Aryan wasn't just rich, he was powerful. His name had graced magazine covers and business awards. His face was a symbol of ambition, luxury, and a kind of success that didn't apologize. But today, stripped of his designer sunglasses and corner office, he sat at the defendant's table, exuding the same arrogance that had made him both feared and admired. He wore a custom charcoal suit, legs crossed confidently, and tapped a Mont-Blanc pen on the polished wood in front of him. It wasn't nervous energy. It was boredom, as though the whole proceeding was a tedious formality beneath his attention. His gaze swept across the room like a man surveying property he already owned. Across from him sat Advocate Nandita Rao, a sharp-eyed labor rights lawyer whose crisp white sari was as severe and unyielding as her cross-examinations. She represented the workers, many of whom hadn't been paid in months, some of whom had suffered injuries in unsafe factories. Today it wasn't about compensation alone. It was about making Aryan Khanna answer publicly for years of impunity. The judge hadn't yet entered. There was still a low-level buzz in the room, punctuated by the occasional camera flash and the shuffle of case files. In one quiet corner, almost invisible to the sea of blazers and robes, a janitor moved methodically, mop in hand. Raghuber, the court's senior custodian, had been sweeping floors here for over 20 years. He knew the smell of fear, the sound of lies, the weight of justice before it was spoken aloud. His movements were practiced, almost graceful and his face calm, but his eyes lingered a beat longer on Aryan. He'd seen men like him before, confident, polished, convinced that money made them untouchable. At 10:03 a.m., the bailiff called, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Mehra." The room obeyed, and in walked a woman with graying hair pulled into a stern knot, glasses low on her nose, and a reputation for being impossible to intimidate. She nodded curtly and took her seat. Let the proceedings begin. The courtroom settled into a taut silence. Nandita rose first. "Your Honor, this is not merely a case of unpaid wages. This is about the value of human dignity, something Mr. Khanna has repeatedly violated for profit." Aryan chuckled under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. Judge Mehra shot him a glance. "You'll speak only when addressed, Mr. Khanna." He raised his hands in mock surrender, but the smirk never left his face. The kind of smirk that said, "Nothing here can touch me." Outside, the sky darkened slightly, as if echoing the weight within the walls. Inside, Raghuber continued to sweep the far side of the gallery, his presence unnoticed by most, irrelevant to many. But he heard every word, every accusation, every arrogant reply. And he remembered. He remembered the rumors that Aryan's factories forced 12-hour shifts in sweltering heat, with no medical aid and no bathroom breaks. He remembered the day a laborer collapsed in the courtroom hallway waiting for a verdict that never came. He remembered sweeping the dried blood from the marble floor. Raghuber's eyes moved back to Aryan. He didn't blink. The room, for now, was following the expected script. Lawyers would argue. The judge would frown. Aryan would smirk. And yet, a quiet current was building. Something small, almost imperceptible. But real. A storm doesn't always begin with thunder. As the prosecution began laying out evidence, Aryan leaned back in his chair, his voice breaking the stillness. "Let's not waste everyone's time. If these people are unhappy, they can quit. It's not my job to babysit the poor." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Mehra raised an eyebrow. But it wasn't her reaction that mattered most. It was Raghuber's slow pause, his mop still on the ground, his grip tightening just slightly on the handle. For the first time in years, his heart raced, not out of fear, but something else. Resolve. Aryan Khanna didn't wait to be invited to speak. His voice rang out with the smooth sharpness of someone too used to talking over people. These allegations, he said with a theatrical sigh, are nothing more than noise. Manufactured outrage from people who don't understand how real businesses work. He adjusted his cufflinks as if brushing off the entire legal system. Judge Mara leaned forward, pen poised above her notepad. Mr. Khanna, the court expects. What? Arian interrupted, smiling without warmth. Decorum? Respect? Let's not pretend this isn't political. I create jobs. I build industries. These grievances are the cost of progress. Across the aisle, Advocate Nandita Rao didn't blink. She'd dealt with men like Arian before, rich, insulated, used to shaping the world to their will. But even by those standards, Arian's audacity was prodigious. She turned a page in her file slowly, allowing the silence to stretch just enough before she stood. If I may, Your Honor, she began, voice level but edged. Mr. Khanna seems to believe that creating jobs gives him license to violate basic human rights. Arian shrugged. Rights? What about responsibilities? Nobody forces them to work. They show up because they need to eat. I simply offer means. And when they collapse from exhaustion, when they lose fingers to unguarded machinery, Nandita snapped. Arian met her gaze without flinching. Occupational hazards. Happens everywhere. A murmur spread to the courtroom, not loud, but sharp, like a blade drawn from its sheath. Even the reporters shifted in their seats, glancing at one another, noting the quote. Judge Mara held up a hand. Enough. Mr. Khanna, you will answer only when asked, and you will do so with restraint. He chuckled. Restraint is for people with something to lose. The judge's jaw tightened. She wrote something on the file before her, underlining it twice. In the back, unnoticed by most, Raghuber stood motionless beside a marble column. His mop leaned quietly against the wall. He was no longer pretending to clean. His eyes, dark and steady, were fixed on Arian. He remembered a winter morning 7 years ago when a factory worker had stumbled into the courthouse, bleeding from the scalp, clothes torn, eyes wild. The man had begged for someone, anyone, to take down his testimony. That man never returned. That file was never found. And Raghuber had been the one to sweep away the trail of blood, to mop the memory from the floor, like it was dirt instead of a human cry. Arian Khanna didn't know it, but Raghuber had watched his empire from the edges. He had seen the workers in torn uniforms, the silent eyes of young boys pressed into night shifts, the women who flinched at sudden sounds. He'd seen it all and stayed silent, because that's what janitors do. They clean up, they don't speak up. But something was shifting now. It wasn't just Arian's arrogance. It was how easily he said it, how comfortably the courtroom allowed it. Nandita resumed, holding up a black and white photograph. This is Gauri Patel, 23, lost both hands in an unguarded dying unit. No compensation, no first aid. She now begs outside the very factory she worked in. Arian barely looked. Tragic. But again, if we investigated every workplace accident in this country, we'd never have time to build anything. The courtroom inhaled sharply, that same collective pause before someone either explodes or implodes. Raghuber's hands clenched behind his back. Not in anger, not yet. In memory, he had seen Gauri once. Not begging, but sitting outside with a thin shawl over her shoulders, feeding stray dogs with her feet. Her spirit had survived what Arian's machines couldn't. That made her strong, and it made Arian small. Judge Mara looked up again, now speaking directly to Arian. Let me remind you, this is a court of law, not a boardroom. Your contempt is noted, and it will be addressed. Arian only smiled, leaning back, crossing his legs. Contempt is earned, Your Honor, just like power. The silence that followed was deep, not empty, but heavy. In the rear corner, Raghuber picked up his mop again, not to clean, but to brace himself. Something inside him had begun to stir, slow, steady, unstoppable. For the first time in years, he was not just a witness. He was becoming a participant. The hearing paused for a 15-minute recess. Lawyers filtered out, some huddled in whispered debate, others checking their phones. Judge Mara remained behind, scribbling notes with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to hear noise but listen only to what mattered. Arian Khanna, predictably, didn't leave his seat. He reclined with the air of a man surveying a luxury lounge, not a courtroom under scrutiny. Raghuber stayed, too. He moved to the center aisle slowly, mop in hand, back straight despite the years carved into his spine. The courtroom had been his silent domain for over 2 decades. He knew which chairs creaked, which light flickered, which tiles absorbed tears, and which ones masked blood. And today, something was different, not just in the words exchanged or the evidence displayed, but in the tone. The atmosphere no longer smelled of routine proceedings. It carried the scent of something raw, unsettled, like the first stirrings before a storm. Arian's voice carried across the room. He was speaking to his lawyer now, a man who looked more like a valet than legal counsel, but loud enough to be overheard. "This whole thing's a circus," Arian said, cracking his knuckles. "The judge wants to look tough. That Rao woman wants a headline. And that girl with no hands? Please, I've donated more to charity galas than her life is worth." The lawyer hesitated, but said nothing. From behind a row of benches, Raghuber stopped. His grip on the mop handle tightened until his knuckles went white. He knew men like Arian. He'd cleaned their messes, literal and figurative, for most of his life. He knew the expensive silence that followed them, the way power could mute even the loudest cries for help. But today, Arian had spoken just a bit too loud. Loud enough to be heard by someone who remembered, someone who was done sweeping things under. Raghuber turned toward him. Their eyes met. Arian gave him a once-over, mop, uniform, graying beard, then looked away, as if Raghuber were part of the wall, as if nothing had looked back. And that's when Raghuber felt it, the precise moment when contempt became courage. He hadn't planned to speak. Not today. Not ever, really. Janitors didn't interrupt trials. They didn't question billionaires. They didn't matter. But something inside him refused to shrink any further. He approached the front of the courtroom slowly, deliberately, placing the mop against the railing like one might lay down a weapon. The lawyer noticed him first and frowned. Arian didn't even glance up until Raghuber spoke. "Sir, just one word. Quiet, but firm." Arian turned, eyebrows lifting. "What? You lost?" Raghuber didn't blink. "No, I found something. My voice." Arian laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, wonderful. The janitor wants a monologue. Should I applaud?" "I've cleaned up after broken men for 20 years, Raghuber said, voice steady. "But none as filthy as the ones who break others and call it ambition." Arian sat upright now, expression tightening. "Is this some kind of stunt? I can have you fired by the end of the hour." "You can't fire what you never saw," Raghuber replied. "You've never seen people like me. Like Gauri, like the thousands who made your empire, while you looked through them like smog on glass." The courtroom had begun to fill again. A few reporters slipped back in mid-sentence, catching the tension in the air. The judge re-entered behind them, surprised to see Raghuber standing near the bench. She paused, observing, but she did not interrupt. Raghuber turned toward her now. "Your Honor, I know I have no standing, no law degree, no suit, but I have memory, and I have truth." Judge Mehra studied him carefully. "You understand this is highly irregular." "Yes, ma'am," he nodded, "but not more irregular than a man treating pain like paperwork." The room was silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't ask for permission. Arian stood, now visibly annoyed. "Is this how we run courts now? Every cleaner with a sob story gets a microphone." Raghuber turned to him, eyes unflinching. "No sob story here, sir. Just a mirror." He took a step back, not waiting for applause, not needing it. He'd said what he came to say. But something had shifted in the air. The courtroom was no longer Arian's arena. It was, for the first time, uncertain. And uncertainty, for men like him, was the beginning of fear. For several seconds, the courtroom didn't breathe. Raghuber's final words, just a mirror, hung in the air like smoke, curling into every corner, settling into every silence. No one moved. Not the bailiff. Not the stenographer. Not even Judge Mehra. who simply sat back, eyes locked on a man still standing with his hands calmly folded before her bench. Arian Khanna was the first to break the spell. He scoffed, loud and theatrical, his voice bouncing off the wood panel walls. "So, that's it," he said, flashing a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're letting janitors deliver monologues now? Shall we give him a robe and gavel while we're at it?" His voice was trying to regain control, but there was a faint tremor in it. Not fear, not yet, but the discomfort of a man used to being looked at without admiration or envy. No one laughed with him, not even his own lawyer. From the press gallery, a camera clicked once. Then again, a young journalist scribbled furiously in the margins of her notebook. "Janitor confronts billionaire in court." It practically wrote itself. Judge Mara folded her hands, her gaze never leaving Ragubir. "Mr. Ragubir," she said slowly, "you are, by your own admission, not a party to this case. And yet, you've spoken with clarity, conviction, and remarkable restraint." Ragubir dipped his head. "Your Honor, I wasn't trying to disrupt proceedings. I've watched too many like this play out without anyone saying the obvious." She raised a brow. "And what, in your opinion, is the obvious?" "That we treat wealth like a virtue," he said. "That power excuses cruelty. And that silence," his eyes flicked to Arian, "is what keeps men like him in their throne." The judge said nothing at first. Then she turned to Arian. "Mr. Khanna, do you wish to respond to that?" Arian's jaw clenched. "I don't respond to janitors." And just like that, the room exhaled. His words didn't strike, they recoiled. Even those predisposed to favor him winced. Ragubir didn't flinch. That's exactly the problem. Judge Mara leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Mr. Khanna, this court has afforded you every opportunity to address the charges brought against you. Instead, you've chosen to belittle victims, dismiss facts, and now insult a citizen for exercising his voice. In the courtroom you mocked just minutes ago." "I pay taxes," Arian said sharply. "I contribute more to this country's economy in a day than he will in a lifetime." "And yet," the judge replied coolly, "he contributes something you seem to have misplaced conscience." A stunned hush swept over the room. Arian opened his mouth, then closed it. His confidence had cracked. Not shattered, but fractured enough for everyone to see it. Nandita Rao rose quietly. "Your Honor, with permission, I'd like to submit new testimony, one that may corroborate Mr. Ragubir's observations, and shed further light on Mr. Khanna's operations." "Proceed." Judge Mara nodded. Ragubir stepped aside, retreating silently to the back of the room, mop in hand once again. But something was different now. He wasn't invisible. Not anymore. As Nandita prepared her statement, Arian leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. The lawyer, stone-faced, whispered back with a curt shake of the head. Something was unraveling. Nandita began. "Your Honor, the court will now hear the recorded statement of Mr. Sanjay Varma, a former supervisor at Khanna Textiles, who fled the country last year after receiving threats for attempting to file an official complaint." She pressed play on a small recorder. A voice crackled to life, weary, trembling, but determined. "I saw men lose their hands. I saw women forced to work through sickness. I saw safety drills skipped, inspections faked, injuries silenced. I saw it all, and I saw who signed off on it." Arian's face turned pale. The courtroom listened, rapt, as the weight of a hidden world began to unspool through a single voice. And at the back, Ragubir stood unmoving. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even trying to be. He was just a man who had stopped pretending not to see. But sometimes, that's where real change begins. When the recording stopped, the courtroom was plunged into a silence so complete it felt like breath had been outlawed. The voice of Sanjay Varma still echoed in the air, vivid, undeniable, stained with the weight of truth. No one dared speak. Even the ever-clicking cameras had paused, as though the lenses themselves had blinked. Arian Khanna sat frozen. For the first time since the trial began, he looked less like a mogul and more like a man cornered. His shoulders were no longer square. His eyes no longer roamed the courtroom like they owned it. He stared at the table in front of him, jaw tight, fingers interlocked in a grip that turned his knuckles white. He had not expected this. He had not expected the janitor. Judge Mara broke the silence, her voice calm but sharp as a scalpel. The court acknowledges Mr. Varma's statement and will accept it into evidence. Arian's lawyer stood hesitantly. Your Honor, the credibility of this witness is questionable. He fled the country under duress and is not available for cross-examination. And yet, Mara said, turning her gaze toward him, he risked his safety to speak, which is more than I can say for your client. Her tone hardened. This court will determine credibility. Not you. The lawyer sat down, defeated. Nandita remained standing. Your Honor, I would like to call attention to a disturbing pattern. Every witness willing to speak against Mr. Khanna has either disappeared, been silenced, or driven into hiding. Mr. Raghuber's testimony is not an anomaly. It is a crack in a dam that has been under pressure for years. She paused, and I suspect it won't be the last. Arian stirred. His voice was low now, strained. This is all hearsay. You're building castles out of gossip. Judge Mara leaned forward. Mr. Khanna, this is not gossip. It is testimony, evidence, and your increasing hostility does little to defend your innocence. Arian's expression shifted, frustration folding into something less performative, more visceral. Fear. He masked it poorly. At the back of Courtroom, Raghuber stood still, arms crossed, mop resting beside him like a companion rather than a tool. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, sharp, patient, didn't leave Arian. He hadn't needed to do much. No legal jargon. No elaborate speeches. Just a truth too long ignored, spoken plainly. And that truth had begun to echo. Judge Mara tapped her pen once against the desk. The sound, crisp and deliberate, was like a gunshot in the quiet room. This court will break for the day, she announced. Tomorrow, we will hear 2 more witness statements and proceed to closing arguments. But let me make something absolutely clear. She turned her eyes directly on Arian. This is no longer a debate over paperwork or PR. This is about people. About lives treated as collateral damage. If you think this court will blink, you are mistaken. She stood, robe flowing behind her like a curtain falling on an act. All rise. Everyone stood. As Judge Mara exited, murmurs swelled. Reporters whispered furiously. Phones buzzed, and courtroom staff shuffled quickly to their next task. But amidst the chaos, Arian didn't move. He looked at the empty judge's bench like it had betrayed him. The weight of something new was settling over his shoulders. The realization that the room no longer bent around his presence. Power, it seemed, had a half-life. Raghuber walked past him, slow, steady, unsmiling. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence now carried weight. As he approached the courtroom doors, a young court clerk, barely out of college, eyes wide with something between awe and disbelief, stopped him. Sir, she said softly, what made you speak up today? He paused, hand resting on the handle. Then he turned slightly and said, almost himself, sometimes the floor isn't dirty. Sometimes the dirt is standing on it. And then he walked out, leaving the courtroom and a trembling legacy of silence behind him. Inside, Arian Khanna remained seated, staring at his reflection in the polished wood. For the first time, he didn't like what he saw. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. There was no chatter among the spectators, no casual shuffling of papers or idle glances toward the press gallery. Attention had settled, not the electric suspense of spectacle, but the heavy quiet of reckoning. Everyone present sensed it. Something irreversible had begun. Arian Khanna sat straighter today, but not out of confidence. He was watching everything now. The reporters scribbling, the bailiff checking his watch, even Raghuber sweeping the far corner, as if the rhythm of his mop could somehow predict the verdict. Judge Mara entered precisely at 10 a.m., her robe rustling softly, her face unreadable. All rise. Everyone stood. She took her seat, removed her glasses, and let her gaze sweep the room before speaking. This court has heard testimonies, reviewed evidence, and witnessed, firsthand, the attitude of the defendant toward both the law and the people his empire relies upon. It has become clear that this is not a case of isolated oversight or managerial error. It is a pattern, one stitched into the very fabric of Mr. Khanna's enterprise. Arian shifted in his chair. His lawyer whispered something, but he didn't respond. His focus remained fixed on the judge, as if he could will her into changing course. She continued, "We are taught that justice is blind, but it is not deaf. It hears the softest voices, and when it listens, it cannot unhear. Yesterday, a man with no legal credentials, no formal education in law, reminded this court why we are here. Mr. Reguber spoke not to argue a case, but to shine a light." The courtroom turned subtly toward the janitor, who paused, mop halfway across the tile. He didn't bow. He didn't nod. He just stood a little taller. Judge Mara placed her glasses back on her nose and addressed Arian directly. "Mr. Khanna, you are a man of means, of influence, and once of reputation. But no man, regardless of stature, stands above accountability. This court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with criminal negligence and labor rights violations. Effective immediately, your assets tied to Khanna Textiles are frozen, and your passport is revoked pending further investigation." A ripple of shock passed through the room. Arian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The words, his favorite weapons, had abandoned him. In their place was silence, cold and absolute. He looked around, seeking an ally. His lawyer avoided his gaze. The media lenses now captured him not as a titan, but as a man who had mistaken fear for respect and lost both. Judge Mara stood. "We are adjourned." The gavel struck once, sharp as a closing door. As people began to exit, Nandita Rao approached Reguber quietly. "You knew what you were doing, didn't you?" she asked, a faint smile curving at the corner of her lips. "No," he said, "but I knew what I couldn't keep doing." She nodded. "Sometimes that's the beginning of everything." He looked back toward Arian, who sat slumped in a chair once built to make men feel important. "Will it change anything?" Nandita followed his gaze. "Maybe not today, but today will be remembered." That's how change starts, with memory refusing to fade. Outside, the sky was bright, a rare softness after a week of gray. Reporters gathered on the steps, flanked by security. Cameras pointed at everyone exiting, but the lenses didn't linger long on Arian anymore. They followed Reguber. He didn't give a statement. He didn't wave. He walked past them all, mop still in hand. Not because he needed it now, but because it had always been part of who he was. The man who cleaned after others. The man no one saw, until he made himself heard. Back inside, Arian Khanna remained seated, flanked by silence. For the first time in his life, he didn't know who would open the door for him, or if anyone would. The courtroom was emptying now, but the verdict would echo far beyond its walls. In factory floors, in break rooms, in the quiet, invisible corners of power where no one had dared to speak, until now. And far down the corridor, Reguber kept walking, not because the floor was dirty, but because the world still was.